Aloha, colleagues. I would like to introduce our team members, Patrick Chevalier, Hannah Ryder, and Tom Falanova. Patrick was born in Brazil to French parents, but is Hawaiian at heart. He has earned his MBA and an MS in Information Systems through HPU, a Master's in Education through Chaminade, and an Associate's in Aeronautics of Mechanical Engineering from the University in Brazil. Hannah hails from a small town in Missouri. She joined the Navy in 2004 and has been stationed in Hawaii, Bahrain, and San Diego and Colorado. She earned her undergraduate in Justice Administration through HPU and looks forward to graduating in May of 2018 with a Master's in Organizational Change. Tom is originally from Germany and was raised in Hawaii. He has a Master's of Fine Arts in Design and a Master's in Educational Leadership. Tom is also working towards his MAOC degree. For our team project, we have identified an organization undergoing crisis, Morgan Stanley, an investment banking company. In order to explain the findings of our research, we conducted a full diagnosis of the organization, with information gathered from multiple sources. We applied the theories and concepts learned throughout our OC 6447 and have developed a change process that follows an action research model. Today, we will discuss Morgan Stanley's origins and company history, and also describe the company's crisis, change processes, and culture. Tom will provide the agents for change and the concepts that characterize the change. Patrick will provide analysis of the change effort through diagnostic models and force field analysis. He will describe what went well and what areas are needing improvement. Finally, I will discuss how to implement the identified changes in order to enhance organizational performance and provide an action plan and potential outcomes. We will close with an opportunity for questions and feedback. Please find our references listed at the end of the presentation.
Morgan Stanley was founded in 1935 by Henry Morgan and George Stanley, along with a few other colleagues who had also left J.P. Morgan. The company rose to preeminence amongst the investment banking community while predominantly focusing on corporate finance. In the early 1970s, along with changing over to a limited liability corporation, they began their sales and trading operation. By 1977, nearly a third of their 1,000 employees were involved in the sales and trading. After a dip in profits during the early 1980s, the company took a more aggressive stance on sales and trading and expanded to asset management and ultimately merchant banking. This included more risky endeavors like leveraged buyouts. These new endeavors were funded by trading shares publicly, which ushered in a new era of success and ultimately led to the 1997 merger with Dean Witter. This merger would prove to be a little difficult since the cultures of the two companies were very different. Dean Witter identified as being consumer oriented, while Morgan Stanley identified with its more traditional elitist roots. Ultimately, the culture of Morgan Stanley won out, and the company would adopt more aggressive stances towards their business models. By 2006, the company was aggressively pushing into the mortgage market. In the years leading up to the financial crisis of 2008, deregulation led to an extreme rise in the amount of subprime mortgage loans made to buyers with poor credit history. These mortgages were then pooled and sold as low-risk securities by financial engineers. The theory was that the individual housing markets would fluctuate independently of one another, and hence a rise in one would stabilize a fall in the other. The pooled mortgages were used to back collateralized debt obligations that were then split into smaller tranches by order of exposure to default and assigned AAA credit ratings, the highest quality of bonds, by agencies backed by the banks themselves. Low interest rates caused by national regulatory agencies and complex global factors caused banks, hedge fund managers, and investors to turn to these high-risk securities because of the potential for higher profits. It also encouraged a culture of high risk taking for short-term payouts in the financial community, particularly since the behavior was rewarded by corporate compensation structures. When the housing market started to fall en masse in 2006, it began a chain reaction that ultimately led collateralized debt obligation securities to be worthless. In turn, banks that could not leverage these worthless assets began to pull their credit in order to balance their books. Industries reliant on this credit began to fail, and the economy began to deteriorate as well. John Mack was named the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of Morgan Stanley in 2005. And he led a push into the investments in these subprime mortgages and CDOs. Although he was able to stabilize the firm by conversion into a bank holding company, the Morgan Stanley did not come out of the crisis unscathed. It wrote off $9.4 billion in losses and paid an initial fine of $4.45 billion for financial misconduct, ultimately paying an additional $3.2 billion to the federal government, individual states, and the Justice Department in 2016. In 2010, James P. Gorman replaced John Mack as CEO at Morgan Stanley. Under Gorman, Morgan Stanley continued to decrease the firm's leverage ratios and also decrease the participation in fixed income trading that was begun by John Mack. In addition, Gorman called for the creation of a risk management and a franchise management committee that would act as Morgan Stanley's internal oversight issues on issues of ethical and risk-taking behavior. These decreases, along with the stabilization of Morgan Stanley's capital position, laid the structural and policy groundwork for Gorman's shift in the organizational culture at Morgan Stanley. In 2013, Gorman would release a report called Sustainability at Morgan Stanley that discussed, among other things, the 4 core values that define its espoused culture: putting clients first, leading with exceptional ideas, doing the right thing and acting with integrity, and thinking like an owner to create long-term shareholder values, and valuing and rewarding honesty. To reinforce their core values, Morgan Stanley would require all new employees to complete training on key topics in the Code of Conduct, and existing employees receive training on emerging issues to include corruption and money laundering. In addition, Gorman identified that the compensation system at Morgan Stanley needed to be changed in order to facilitate both their alignment to their core values and mitigation of excessive risk-taking.
So let's go to talk a little bit about diagnosis of change. Okay, we want to understand the cause of lack of alignment between the culture and the compensation. Okay, so to understand a little bit these two constructs, so let's go to see in the graph. So in the x-axis you have the culture, and in the y-axis you have compensation. The culture can be salary friendly or incentive friendly, and the compensation can be a fixed pay or a variable pay. This is very, very important to match these two constructs, okay? For example, if you have a salary friendly, so a good salary, so it's very important to have a fixed pay and not a variable pay. If you have an incentive friendly, it's very important to have a variable pay and not a fixed pay. So this first thing important at Morgan Stanley is match the culture with compensation. You need to understand a little bit about organizational level diagnostic model. So it's a very important tool, okay, to understand what's really happening with Morgan Stanley. Okay, so first in the inputs you have the general environment and industry structure. So the most important thing happening in the environment was the financial crisis in 2007 and 2009. The design components, the most important is strategy and HR system, because strategy is very important to understand is that the bank start to offer mortgages to people with bad credit, and they receive, so the HR gives some bonus, some compensation to do that. And so this is happening. The result of these investments were bankruptcy, foreclosure, and unsustainable economy. Okay, so this way that HR offered rewards based in stocks. So in the end, the company was penalized with $235 billion. Let's go to understand the first field analysis. Okay, so you need to understand the driving force, the restraint force to go in a change for a desired state. You want that Morgan have a value, a financial value in the operations. Okay, so the driving force will be first finish the high salaries, the bonus the executive have. Also sustainability, you need to some way the financial need to have value. Okay, so for example here, driving forces, you can accept this code of conduct in the employees. Okay, because the employees is some way have some corruption there. Okay, because he knows maybe, oh, okay, this client can afford this house, but if I give a mortgage for him, so I receive some bonus, I have some benefits. And so even if have a very high risk, okay, he don't care. HR is okay. I give you proportion money if you do more mortgage. So this was the rule, this was the culture, this was the compensation. So we need to understand the driving the restraint force to go in a desired state, that value, that the financial is really, really on the ground. So have some very important about ethical and legal issues. Okay, so what's really happened was two surveys, one for Economist Intel Unit and the second one for the University of Notre Dame. So this problem will happen with Morgan Stanley and the others banks start to go to the public. Okay, this wrongdoing in workplace, this compensation, this culture. So everything start to see this scandal. Okay, so the reaction was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer and Protection Act of 2010. So now, for example, the incentive compensation that cause material loss or inappropriate risk taking. So now have some protection, so avoid to happen the same thing in the future.
In the process to implement change, we utilize Lewin's change model and Cotter's 8-stage change process as a guide. Kurt Lewin's unfreeze, change, refreeze model is a method sometimes used to implement change. This process can aid in identifying what changes are needed, how to implement those changes, and to ensure feedback from the change is received. The unfreeze process, in Morgan Stanley's case, would be to assess what the initial issues are regarding workplace climate, the company culture, and identification of risks. These steps allowed us to identify what needs to change. The key item to keep in mind during the change stage is communication. The employees should understand what the changes will be and the purpose behind them. Short-term goals would be implemented so there are small wins along the way. The third stage of Lewin's model focuses on ensuring the changes implemented become a part of the company's culture. Stakeholders must be willing to adapt if necessary. John P. Cotter's 8-step change management model can be utilized to analyze Morgan Stanley's key issues. As Vandenberg and Piertsma define, Cotter's 8 phases of change is a systematic approach to achieving successful, sustainable change by breaking down the change process into 8 phases. From multiple studies, it is found that the errors made during change processes are complacency, failing to create a substantial team, underestimating the need for a clear mission and vision, not recognizing roadblocks, failing to create short-term goals, and not trying to change the company's culture. Gorman and the leaders of Morgan Stanley created a sense of urgency to change their compensation regime by presenting the company with the fallout of the financial crisis of 2008. This made it clear to the leaders, members, and stakeholders that change needed to occur to prevent another collapse in the future. Morgan Stanley's collective will to change was by and large dictated by external forces. The leadership within the organization did leverage these external forces to create survival anxiety and unfreeze the organization. By creating a core cadre of leaders and creating the risk and franchise committees to initiate the change at Morgan Stanley, Gorman created a guiding coalition that would also serve as an internal oversight once the changes had been implemented. These committees helped decrease learning anxiety and helped to begin the implementation of the change after unfreezing. The guiding coalition of leaders and committee members also helped to create the shared vision. We advise, originate, trade, manage, and distribute capital for governments, institutions, and individuals, and always do so with a standard of excellence. By releasing the 2013 Sustainability Report, they outlined the vision for change, as well as codified the culture. Gorman is sharing the vision for change. The vision and its continued communication builds capacity for new learning, helps to overcome old habits, and sets the parameters for modeling behavior that is a key part of the change phase of Lewin's model. The creation of the committees constitutes the empowering of people to act. Moving forward, it will facilitate the change's staying power and be embodied in the lasting culture as permanent behaviors when the organization refreezes its culture. Morgan Stanley has celebrated its survival and climbed back to the top of the industry, and they can attribute their success to culture. However, there is no indication that they built in small wins, celebrated successes along the way, or consolidated them to move the change forward. This reiterates the fact that while seemingly successful, the changes at Morgan Stanley reflect a change in policies and strategy, not necessarily a change in culture. As successful as Morgan Stanley has been at rebounding from the financial crisis and apparently learning from the mistake that led them to it, it's not clear if they will hold up the external forces that drove them, regulation and public opinion. Will they change? The core value noted by Gorman existed at Morgan Stanley prior to the crisis of 2008. How they were manifested post-crisis and into the future was heavily reliant on the change in the compensation system that is at the heart of their culture. Both Mack and Gorman were beneficiaries of the previous compensation regime at Morgan Stanley, with Mack receiving the highest executive bonus ever noted for a CEO in 2006. Their behavior as leaders helped them to embed the encouragement of risk-taking that is at the root of the company's culture. Of note, the key proponents for the culture change were the very ideals that the company can associate their success to. We believe that the compensation methods are both a determining factor of culture and an innate expression of the culture at Morgan Stanley. We also agree that despite pitfalls in its execution, that the change in the culture-driving aspect of compensation regimes has both occurred and has to this point been successful. We believe there are ways to enact change beyond policy and structure, and ways to embed the adjustments into the fabric of their culture. We will look at the short-term and long-term goals. For the short term, leadership will need to continue communicating the vision and expand the focus beyond at just the management level. The specific behaviors aforementioned were notated by senior management, but those same behaviors were expressed by employees up and down the chain. Second, members should feel safe to voice concerns about ethical behavior, free of lashback from leadership or complicating their ability to be promoted. HR and legal needs to be trained and also empowered to monitor ethical concerns involving irregular compensation or standards in general. Feedback should be provided to leadership. In the future, surveys will be conducted to monitor ethical and compensatory concerns. Small wins should be celebrated and employees should be rewarded for minor and major success. For the long term, metrics collected from HR and legal will be reviewed to identify any ethical or legal wrongdoing. These particular cases will be addressed by the CEO directly, when appropriate, or the relevant manager if it can be handled at that level. Secondly, a formalized training plan, mandatory for every employee, will be implemented based on Morgan Stanley's legal and ethical regulations. Training will also detail compensation standards and work center rules. Quarterly meetings will be held with stakeholders, and bi-weekly meetings with the upper management will be set in place to mitigate any difficulties in implementing the short and long-term changes. Additionally, recruitment efforts will focus on the top talent to fit the right position based on experience and skill set. A third committee will be created to analyze external changes in the regulatory and industry environment to identify and mitigate external forces that threaten the change. Putting the short-term and long-term actions into place will enhance the organization's performance and will be a good start to further implement change at Morgan Stanley. Potential risks involve the company's senior management and leaders reverting to pre-change behaviors or finding technical loopholes to subvert the change implementation. In these cases, the managers would need to be convinced to align with the goals of the firm or be removed. Incoming CEOs may not understand the beliefs, culture, and upcoming changes. The board of directors and senior management must communicate the need for change to both select and foster candidates appropriately. The regulatory constraints, governmental interventions, and public opinions that have driven the change effort may change or cease to exist altogether. The CEO must refer to both the history that drove the initial change as well as ongoing evidence of internal oversight committees, HR, and legal, to stay the course or risk reversion to behaviors and culture that have historically been proven to be detrimental to both the company and the company at large. In continuing the new change effort, communication must be transparent between employees, leadership, management, stakeholders, and CEOs. If the employees see the upper leadership is willing to change, they will follow suit. Morgan Stanley will continue to see improvements in workplace conduct, a more standardized career progression, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. Ultimately, this will become a permanent change in the organization's culture, benefiting employees and the overall success of Morgan Stanley. We have explained the findings of our research, identified the context for change, key agents for change, and methods for improvement to enhance performance at Morgan Stanley. We would like to pause for questions and feedback. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for your attention.